The blow landed before any of us understood it was coming, and I have spent every day since trying to forget the sound of it and failing. I was standing at the foot of the great steps with my clipboard and my list of names, the way a junior protocol clerk stands at every state arrival, useful, invisible, and terrified of getting a title wrong. The morning was bright and cold over the forecourt of Aldgrave, the long gravel sweep raked into clean lines, the gilded railings catching the early sun, the two host sentries fixed at their boxes like figures cut from one block of stone. We had rehearsed this welcome for 9 days. I knew where the carriages would halt, where the household would form, where the foreign banner would break out above the inner arch. I knew everything except what a man's open hand makes when it strikes a boy's face in the open air, in front of 200 people, and how the whole forecourt seemed to hold its breath in the half-second afterward, as if the sound itself were waiting to see what we would do about it. The man who struck the blow was the Margrave of Hesterin. I will call him that, because that was the title on my list, and I never once heard anyone use a smaller word for him. He had come as the chief envoy of a far inland power, 3 days' travel and a fortnight of letters between our two courts, and he had stepped down from his carriage into our welcome like a man stepping onto land he already owned. Tall, silver at the temples, a coat heavy with cord and order. He had a way of looking at our palace that I can only describe as appraisal, as though he were pricing the stone. The boy who took the blow was his own attendant. I did not know his name then. He could not have been 20. He wore the Margrave's house livery, gray and plum, a little too large at the shoulders, and he carried a flat traveling case in both hands the way you carry something you have been told is worth more than you are. When the carriage door opened, the boy had moved to set the folding step, and the step had stuck, or his hand had slipped on the cold brass, and the Margrave's polished boot had come down half an inch short of where it expected the world to be. A small thing, a nothing. In 9 days of rehearsal I had watched our own footmen fumble a dozen worse. The Margrave came down anyway, recovered his balance without effort, and then he turned, unhurried, and struck the boy across the face with the back of his gloved hand. It was not a flail. That is what I keep coming back to. It was not temper. It was correction measured, public, almost bored, the gesture of a man who has done it many times and expects the air around him to approve. The boy's head turned with it. The traveling case stayed in his arms. He did not drop it even then, even struck. Some hard-trained instinct kept his grip while the rest of him flinched. A red mark bloomed on his cheek in the cold light. And the Margrave was already turning back to face our household, smoothing his glove, his expression composed into the pleasant mask of a guest, as if nothing whatever had occurred and the next item of the morning might now proceed. I want to tell you that the forecourt erupted. It did not. That is the part no one believes when I describe it. 200 people, household, guests, the press of curious staff at the windows above, and what fell over us was not outrage but a kind of paralysis. Because none of us knew the rule. The boy was not ours. The man was a guest, an envoy, a personage we had spent a fortnight learning to honor. Our controller stood frozen at the head of the line with the welcome on his lips. Our own great folk looked at their shoes. I looked at my clipboard, God help me, and read the same name 3 times without seeing it, because some cowardly part of me had decided that if I kept my eyes on the list, this would not have happened. And the boy stood there with the mark rising on his face, and the case in his arms and his eyes fixed on the gravel. And he waited. You could see him wait for the rest of his morning to be exactly like every other morning of his life. That is when I heard the boot scrape. It was a small sound, but in that frozen forecourt it carried like a struck bell. One of the host sentries, the left-hand box, nearest the steps, had moved his foot, just shifted his weight. I had stood at enough arrivals to know that the sentries do not move. They are the one fixed thing the public can rely on. A marching column could pass, and they would not so much as track it with their eyes. So when I heard that single scrape of a boot heel turning on stone, I looked, the way you look toward the one wrong note in a piece of music, and I saw him for the first time as a man rather than a fixture. He was perhaps 40, tall in the bearskin, the red wool of the tunic immaculate, white gloves on the rifle, the chin strap a hard line across a still face. And the face was not still anymore. It was not raging. I want to be precise about this, because everything that followed depends on it. It was something worse for the Margrave than rage. It had gone very calm and very awake, the way water goes flat and clear just before it moves. His eyes had come off the middle distance, where a sentry's eyes are supposed to live, and they had found the boy. And then they had found the Margrave. And I understood, watching him, that the host sentry of Aldgrave had just made a decision, and that all the protocol I had memorized for 9 days was about to meet something older and harder than protocol. I did not know his name yet either. I learned it later, the way you learn the name of a man who has changed the shape of your life. Sergeant Aldous Brenner, 11 years at the gate, a quiet man with a quiet record, the kind of soldier the household forgets it has because he never once gives it a reason to remember him. But on that morning he was only the left-hand box, and he was turning his head, and the turning of that head was the loudest thing that had happened since the blow. The Margrave felt it. Men like that always feel a gaze that has weight in it. He looked across the gravel, found the sentry looking back, and his composed face flickered surprise first that any of us had the bad manners to be looking at all, and then a small, indulgent contempt, because what was a sentry to a Margrave? A piece of the architecture. A painted soldier set at the door for decoration. He gave the guard the briefest glance a man can give a doorpost, and turned again to our controller, and lifted one hand in a graceful little gesture that meant, "Shall we proceed?" And Sergeant Brenner took one step forward off his box. One step. It does not sound like much, but I had stood at that exact spot for 9 mornings, and I knew to the inch where the sentry's box ended and the host ground of the forecourt began, and I knew that in 11 years that man had almost certainly never crossed that line on his own initiative in front of a soul. The household above us went silent in a new way. My clipboard slid in my hands. And somewhere in my chest, a cold, clear voice that did not sound like my usual self said, "Now we find out what kind of place this is." He did not march at the Margrave. That was the first thing that told me this was no loss of temper. A man in a rage covers ground fast and ugly. Brenner moved the way the sentries are taught to move when they relieve the watch. A measured, ceremonial tread, slow enough that you could count it, deliberate enough that no one could ever say afterward that he had charged a foreign guest. He came down off the line of his box and across 2 yards of raked gravel, and he placed himself not between the Margrave and our household, but between the Margrave and the boy. He turned his shoulder to the great man and put his red back to him, and he stood over the attendant the way a wall stands over a doorway, and he looked down at the boy with the traveling case still clutched against his chest. I was close enough to hear it. The forecourt was that quiet. "Are you hurt?" the sergeant said. It was not a question the way I write it. He did not lift his voice. There was no music in it at all, just 4 flat words laid down like stones. The boy did not answer. I think he had forgotten that anyone could speak to him as though his answer mattered. He stared up at the immaculate red figure over him with an expression I have never been able to name. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more frightened than gratitude. The look of a man who has been shown a door he is not allowed to walk through and cannot understand why it has opened. And the Margrave's voice came across the gravel like a blade drawn clean. "You," he said, "step back to your post." I have heard a great many orders given in that forecourt. We are, when you come down to it, a household built on the giving and taking of orders. But I had never heard one delivered with such absolute certainty that it would be obeyed. The Margrave did not even raise his hand. He simply said the words, in the tone of a man flicking dust from a sleeve, and turned half away again toward our controller as though the matter were already closed and the sentry already gone. Brenner did not move. The silence stretched. I watched our controller's face go from white to a sick gray, because the controller understood, as I was only beginning to, that we had arrived at the exact thing 9 days of rehearsal had never imagined. A guest had given an order on our ground, and one of our own men had not obeyed it, and now every soul in the forecourt was waiting to see which of those two facts the House of Aldgrave would choose to stand behind. The Margrave turned the rest of the way around. The pleasant mask was gone now. What replaced it was not anger either. That is what made him formidable. It was a cold administrative interest, the look of a man noting an irregularity for later correction. "Does this one belong to you?" he asked, and he was speaking now to our controller over the sergeant's head, as if Brenner were a misbehaving dog that its owner had failed to leash. "I will overlook it. I understand that your people are not accustomed to receptions of this scale, but you will want to remove him before we go in. I do not care to be stared at by the furniture." The furniture. I felt the word land on the back of my own neck, and I watched Sergeant Brenner, who had heard it, who must have heard it not so much as twitch. He kept his back to the Margrave and his eyes on the boy, and when he spoke again it was still to the attendant in that same level voice, as though the great man behind him were weather and nothing more. "What is your name?" he said. It took the boy 3 tries to find his voice, and when it came it was barely more than breath. "Pieter," he said. "My Lord Pieter." "Not your lord," said Brenner. "Just Sergeant, stand up straight, Pieter, you've done nothing wrong." Now I want you to understand what that sentence cost, because at the time I did not, and it has taken me years to learn the weight of it. "You've done nothing wrong." 4 words. But to say them, Brenner had to contradict, on his own ground, in front of 200 witnesses, a foreign envoy who had just publicly declared by his own hand that the boy had done plenty wrong, enough to be struck for. He had set the word of a sergeant against the word of a Margrave, and he had set it down for the benefit of a livery boy nobody in that forecourt had been willing to look at 30 seconds before. It should have been the smallest moment of the morning. It was the largest. Because a household watches its sentries, the way a man watches the spirit level when he is building a wall, and what they saw was the level holding true while a great weight leaned on it. The Margrave's patience, such as it had been, ran out. "Controller," he said, and now there was iron under the silk. "I have come a long way at your sovereign's invitation. I have brought treaties your court wishes very much to sign. I will not be made to stand in your courtyard while a doorman lectures my servant. Remove this man, or I shall conclude that the House of Aldgrave does not know how to receive a guest, and I shall write to my own court accordingly. You understand me, I think. You understand exactly what I am saying." And he was right. We all understood exactly what he was saying. He was saying, "I am worth more to your kingdom than this sentry is, and we both know it, so make the arithmetic and give me my way." It was not even an unreasonable thing for him to believe. A fortnight of letters had told him so. Half the household had spent 9 days behaving as though it were true. Our controller opened his mouth. I saw him do the arithmetic. I saw him weigh the treaties and the letters and his own long career, and I saw the answer the arithmetic gave him, and it was the wrong answer, and he knew it was the wrong answer even as it climbed his throat, and that is the worst kind of failure there is, the kind you watch arrive and cannot stop. "Sergeant," the controller said in a voice gone thin, "stand down, return to your post." And Sergeant Brenner, for the first time, looked away from the boy. He looked up, past the Margrave, past the controller, to the head of the great steps, where the household banner hung over the inner arch, and where a second figure had appeared at the top of the stairs without any of us noticing her come. She was an old woman in dark gray, plainly dressed for so grand a morning, with a silver chain of office at her breast and a face like a closed door. I knew her, of course. Everyone in the household knew her, the way you know the keel of the ship you sail in. She was the marshal of the household, the senior keeper of the king's roof, the one office in Aldgrave that answered to the sovereign alone and stood above even the controller. We did not see her at arrivals. She did not come down to the forecourt for guests. That she was standing now at the head of the steps, with her hands folded and her eyes very steady on the gravel below, meant that someone at a high window had sent for her in a great hurry, and that she had come at a speed an old woman does not usually allow herself. She did not call out. She simply began to descend, one stair at a time, her gray skirts whispering on the stone, and the whole forecourt turned toward her the way iron filings turn toward a magnet. The Margrave watched her come with a flicker of recalculation behind his eyes. Here, at last, was someone of a rank he recognized. When she reached the bottom of the steps, she did not go to the Margrave. She went to the boy. She stopped in front of Pieter, beside the red wall of the sergeant, and she looked at the rising mark on his cheek with a long, unhurried attention that was somehow more terrible than any shout. Then she lifted her eyes not to the Margrave first, but to Sergeant Brenner, and she said quietly, in a voice pitched to carry no farther than it must, "Report, Sergeant." "A guess struck this lad across the face, ma'am," said Brenner, "on the host ground. I came off my box to see he wasn't struck again." "And the controller's order to stand down." "I've heard it, ma'am." "And you did not obey it?" "No, ma'am. I judged it the wrong order. I'll answer for that to whoever has the right to hear it." The marshal turned at last to the Margrave. "And here is the thing I have never forgotten, the thing I have tried to live by ever since." She did not raise her voice, she did not threaten, she did not so much as frown. She inclined her head to him in a small, exact, courteous bow, the bow due to a great envoy of a friendly power, and she spoke to him with perfect, unhurried civility, and every word of it was a wall going up. "My Lord Margrave," she said, "you are most welcome at Aldgrave, and your visit honors this house. I am the marshal of the household. I speak here with the king's own voice. Permit me to explain a custom of our roof, for it is one a guest could not be expected to know, and I would not have you offended again in ignorance." "A custom," the Margrave repeated. The word came back cold. "Madam, I have no quarrel with your customs. I have a quarrel with your discipline. Your soldier defied a direct order before your entire court." "He did," she agreed without a flicker. "And he was right to. That is the custom I would explain." She let the silence sit a moment, the way a builder lets mortar set. "Under this roof, my lord, and on the ground that lies within these gates, no man may strike a servant. Not yours, not ours, not any. Within our walls the lowest groom and the highest envoy stand under the same protection of the king's peace, and the sentries at these boxes are not ornaments, they are the keepers of that peace. A guest may bring his rank through our gates. He may not bring a free hand. The moment your hand fell on this boy on the king's ground, it became the sergeant's lawful business to stand between you and a second blow. He did his duty exactly. Had he done less, I should have broken him for it." I heard a sound run through the household ranged along the steps, not a gasp, nothing so theatrical, but a kind of long exhalation, 200 people letting go of a breath they had been holding since the blow, because she had said it. Whatever sick arithmetic the controller had done, whatever a fortnight of deferential letters had taught us all to assume, the marshal had stood on the gravel in front of the foreign banner and named the rule out loud, and the rule was not for sale. The Margrave's face did something I had never seen a great man's face do. It did not crumble, men like that do not crumble, but a kind of cold understanding moved across it, the understanding of a man who has just discovered that the ground he thought he owned is not, in fact, for sale at any price he can pay. "You would risk a treaty," he said slowly, "over a livery boy." "No, my lord," said the marshal, "you would. We are merely declining to help you do it." For a long moment the Margrave said nothing, and I watched him reach, as such men always do, for the lever that has never once failed him. He found it. He drew himself up, and he turned a little so that his words would carry to the whole forecourt, and to the high windows where, by now, every idle face in Aldgrave was pressed to the glass. "Then hear me, Marshal," he said, "and hear me well, all of you. I am the chosen voice of my prince. I carry the treaties of the eastern passes in that case there, the very case this clumsy boy nearly let fall in the dirt. I have the authority to take them home unsigned. If I cross these gates again as a man who has been lectured and defied in your courtyard, made small before 2 courts over a doorman and a servant, then I shall cross them for the last time, and the agreements your king has labored a year to win will go back into the saddlebags they came from. Now, I will ask once more plainly before witnesses, so that the cost is clear to every soul who hears it. Will you order your soldier back to his box and let me forget this morning, or will you spend a treaty on a livery boy's pride? It was, I will admit, a fearsome thing to hear said aloud. The whole weight of the visit, the letters, the long preparation, the king's own hopes, he had gathered it all up and set it on one side of the scale, and on the other he had set a frightened boy in a too large coat, and he had invited us to watch the scale tip. I think a part of every person in that forecourt felt the pull of it. I felt it. The clerk's small, cowardly arithmetic woke up in me again, and whispered that surely, one boy's bruise was not worth a year of statecraft, that the kind thing and the wise thing both pointed the same way, toward giving the great man his way and getting on with the morning. The marshal of the household let him finish. She let the threat stand in the cold air until everyone had measured it, and then she answered him, and her voice had not risen by a hair. My lord, you have stated the cost plainly, and I thank you for it lets me answer plainly in turn. You believe you have set a treaty against a boy. You have not. You have set a treaty against the king's peace under the king's roof, and that peace is the one thing in this kingdom not mine to sell, nor the controller's, nor my sovereign's at any price you could name. A treaty signed by a house that strikes its guests' servants in its own forecourt, and calls it nothing is not worth the wax it is sealed with. For a house that will trade its own law for your favor today will trade your treaty for someone else's tomorrow, and you, my lord of all men, know it. You did not come a fortnight's road to make a bargain with a house that has no spine, so I will tell you what we will do, and it is the only offer Aldgrave will make. The sergeant stays where he stands. The boy stays under the king's peace, as every soul on this ground does. And you, my lord, are welcome, most welcome, to go into dinner as our honored guest, the moment you have given me your word before these witnesses, that no hand of yours will fall again on any servant while you stand upon our ground. That is the whole of it. The choice of treaty or no treaty was never ours. It is, and has always been, entirely yours. I do not think the Margrave had ever in his long life been answered like that, not refused exactly, but met squarely with perfect courtesy by someone who simply would not move. He stood there with his threat hanging useless in the air and the eyes of 2 courts on him, and I watched the calculation run behind his face, and I watched him arrive, at last, at the one fact the marshal had counted on from the start, that a man does not travel a fortnight's road to come home with nothing, and that the only person in the forecourt who actually could not afford to walk away was him. But men like the Margrave do not yield to a wall. They look for the soft place beside it, and his eyes, narrowing, slid off the marshal and the sergeant and the high cold windows, and came to rest on Pieter. The boy will speak for me, he said suddenly, and there was something almost pleasant in it again, which frightened me far more than the iron had. Of course. We are making a great noise over nothing, and the one person who can end it has not been asked. Pieter, come here. Tell the good marshal that this is a misunderstanding, that no harm was done, that you wish to go in with your master and forget this foolishness. Tell her, Pieter, and we may all of us be warm and fed within the hour. He smiled. You would not want to be the cause of a quarrel between 2 great courts. You know what becomes of servants who cause their masters trouble. Speak. And there it was, the cruelest move on the board, the one I had not seen coming, and the marshal, I think, had. He could not break the marshal, so he would break the boy and use the boy to break the rule. He would make Pieter himself walk to the center of that forecourt, and with 200 people watching and his master's eyes on his back and a lifetime of fear in his bones, say out loud that the blow had been nothing, that he forgave it, that he wanted it forgotten, And once the boy had said it, the whole of the marshal's wall would have nothing left to stand on. Pieter took a step forward. Of course he did. His legs were already moving before his mind had a vote in the matter, the long obedience of his whole life carrying him toward his master's voice. I saw the boy's face, and it was the face of a creature who has been taught that the only safety lies in saying yes, and I knew with a sick certainty that he was going to do it, that he was going to stand in the middle of Aldgrave and lie about his own face to keep the peace he had been beaten into keeping his entire life. And Sergeant Brenner put out one white-gloved hand, not to stop him, only to rest it lightly on the boy's shoulder, and he leaned down and said something to him that I was just close enough to hear. "You don't have to lie for him here," the sergeant said. "Not on this ground. Whatever you've had to do every other day of your life, not here. Here you are under the king's peace, and the king's peace says a man may tell the truth and walk away whole. Nobody on this gravel will let a hand fall on you for it. That's my word, and it's hers. The smallest movement of his head toward the marshal, and it's the king's. Tell what happened or tell nothing at all, but you will not be made to lie." I have heard a great many speeches in that forecourt over the years. State addresses, declarations, the high music of diplomacy. I have never heard anything that moved a soul the way those plain words moved that boy, because no one, I think, had ever told Pieter that the truth was a thing he was allowed to have. He had been struck for the truth, struck for less than the truth, his whole short life, and here was a stranger in a red coat, kneeling a little to be on his level, telling him that on this one patch of ground in all the world the lie was not required of him. Pieter turned and looked back at his master. The Margrave smiled and made the small gesture again, "Come along," the gesture that had moved the boy 1,000 times. And for one terrible instant I thought the long habit would win, because how do you set down in a single morning the whole weight of a life? But the boy did not move toward him. He stood very still, and I saw, with something turning over in my chest, that he had learned the stillness from somewhere, that the lowest servant of a brutal house learns to be still the way a sentry does, and that for once in his life he was going to use that stillness for himself. "He struck me," Pieter said. It was barely louder than the wind. He had to say it twice before it carried. "He struck me," he said again, and his voice cracked in the middle of it and held, because the step stuck. It was cold, and the brass was cold, and my hand slipped, and he struck me across the face in front of all your people. That is what happened. I am not going to say it was nothing." He drew a breath that shook the whole of him. "It was not nothing. It is never nothing. I would just rather not be struck for the truth of it here, where the soldier says I needn't be. There are silences and there are silences. The one that fell then had a quality I have only met a handful of times in a long life at court. The silence of a great many people all realizing the same thing at the same moment, which was that we had very nearly, all of us, stood by and let a frightened boy be taught one more time that his pain did not count. The shame of it went through the household like a cold draft. I saw the controller close his eyes. I felt the heat climb my own face. We had been ready to pay the boy as the price of our comfort, and the only two people on that whole grand forecourt who had refused the bargain were an old woman with a chain of office and a sergeant who had stepped off his box. The Margrave's mask broke at last. Not into rage, even then, not quite. It broke into something smaller and more human and far less impressive than the figure who had stepped down from the carriage owning everything he saw. It broke into the face of a man who has discovered, in front of 2 courts, that the world does not in fact run the way he has spent 60 years assuming it must, and that there is nothing whatever he can do about it. He looked at his servant, who was looking back at him now, frightened still but upright, with a sergeant's hand on his shoulder and a marshal at his side, and the whole king's peace at his back. And the Margrave understood that the one creature in the world he had always been able to command had, for this single morning, slipped entirely beyond his reach. He turned to the marshal. When he spoke his voice had gone flat and careful, a man counting his losses and looking for the door. Your custom, he said, is noted. I would not have it said that I made war on a kingdom's hospitality over a matter of household discipline. You have my word since you will have it. No hand of mine will fall on any servant while I stand upon your ground. A pause. Are you satisfied, Marshal? I am satisfied with your word, my lord, she said, and bowed to him again, exactly as low as before, no lower and no higher, so that everyone could see he was still an honored guest and still entirely checked. You are most welcome to dine. The boy will not attend you at table this evening. He will be seen to by our own people and rest under our roof tonight as our guest, not your servant. You will not want for service. We keep enough hands for two. Tomorrow you may settle your household as you see fit beyond our gates, but while he is on Aldgrave ground, he is under the king's peace, the same as you. I trust that is also noted. The Margrave looked for a moment, as though he would argue the last of it. Then he looked at the 200 faces, and the high windows, and the immovable red sergeant, and the boy who would not lie, and he did the only thing left to a man in his position. He inclined his head a bare half-inch, the smallest bow a great man can make and still call it a bow, and he turned and walked up the great steps toward the doors, alone, his treaties in another man's arms, his free hand empty at his side. He signed them, by the way. That is the part the household argued over for months afterward, in the kitchens and the corridors, the great unanswerable question of whether the marshal had gambled the kingdom, and won, or had simply been right all along. He signed the treaties of the Eastern Passes 3 days later, every clause of them, and went home. I came to understand slowly why. A man like the Margrave respects exactly one thing in all the world, and it is not kindness and it is not law, it is a wall he cannot move. He had spent a fortnight's road and a year of letters believing that Aldgrave was a soft house that would trade anything for his favor, and he had nearly been right. What changed his mind was not the treaty and not the threat. It was a sergeant who would not step back and an old woman who would not raise her voice, and the discovery that there was, in this kingdom, a thing that could not be bought. You do not, it turns out, make lasting bargains with people you can buy. You make them with people you cannot. He went home having learned that Aldgrave could not be bought, and a court that cannot be bought is a court whose word, when it gives it, is worth carrying home. So he carried it home, signed. But that is statecraft, and statecraft was never the heart of that morning. The heart of it was this. When the doors had closed on the Margrave and the forecourt began, at last, to breathe and shuffle and remember itself, the marshal of the household turned to Sergeant Brenner, and in front of the whole assembled court she did a thing I had never seen done at Aldgrave and have seen only once or twice since. She bowed to him, to a sergeant. The senior keeper of the king's roof bent her gray head to a man of the gate, and she said, loud enough for the household to hear and remember, "You kept the peace this house could not keep for itself. Thank you, sergeant." And then, quieter, only to him, 11 years I've watched you stand there and thought the post was wasted on a man so steady nothing ever happens at it. I was wrong. The steadiness was the point. Go and stand it again. And he did. That is the part I find I cannot get past, even now. He came to attention, and he turned, and he marched back across the 2 yards of gravel in that same measured ceremonial tread, and he stepped up onto his box, and he became once more a figure cut from a single block of stone, eyes forward, rifle still, as though nothing whatever had occurred and the next item of the morning might now proceed. As though he had not, 10 minutes before, set his whole career and a kingdom's treaty on the strength of 4 flat words to a frightened boy. The mark of what he had done was nowhere on him. That is the discipline, I think, not the standing still, which any patient man can learn, but the stepping off the box at the one moment it is needed, and the stepping back on as though it cost you nothing, when it cost you everything. I went and found Pieter that evening, in a quiet corner of the household where our own people had fed him and seen to his face and given him a bed. I had my clipboard still, from old habit, though there was nothing left on it to do. I asked him, for no reason I could name, whether he was all right. He thought about it a long while. "I have never," he said at last, "been somewhere a thing like that could happen, where a soldier comes off his post for someone like me. I didn't know there were places like that." He looked up at me. "Are there many?" I have thought about his question for years, and I am still not certain of the honest answer. There are not many. I have seen enough of courts and great men to know that the soft arithmetic, the boy is not worth the treaty, the truth is not worth the trouble, look at your clipboard and it will not have happened, wins far more mornings than it loses. But there is at least one place where it does not. There is at least one patch of raked gravel under one cold sun, where a man may slip on cold brass and tell the truth of it and walk away whole, because two people decided that the piece of the least man on the ground was the same piece as the greatest, and a sergeant proved it with his body. Pieter did not go back to the Margrave's service. The marshal saw to that quietly, the way she saw to everything. Some arrangement was made between the courts, some small face-saving fiction, and the boy stayed. He works at Aldgrave still. I see him most mornings crossing the forecourt about his duties, and he never passes the left-hand box without a glance and a small nod toward it, whoever happens to be standing there, and the man on the box, whoever he is, gives the nod back, because they all know the story now. It is part of the post. They will tell you, if you ask at the gate, that there is one rule older at Aldgrave than any treaty, and that a hard old woman and a steady sergeant carved it into the stone of the place one cold morning where the whole world could watch. That under this roof and on this ground, the lowest servant stands in the same peace as the highest king, and there is no guest, however great, who may strike him here. I keep my own list a little differently now. I learned that morning that the names on a clipboard are not the work. The work is the boy you forgot to write down, the one nobody thought to protect, and whether, when his moment comes, there is somebody steady enough to step off the box.